Hello and welcome back to Coming Home Network Presents, where we talk about the kinds of questions that people wrestle with when they're exploring the Catholic faith and wondering if they should become a part of it. I'm Matt Swaim, Director of Outreach here at the Coming Home Network. You can visit us at CHNetwork.org and find all kinds of great stories, including the story of the gentleman we're going to have on today. But stories from people from every background you could possibly imagine. Today we're going to talk about the Anglican and Catholic kind of relationship and how it has culminated in a really interesting way in the past several years through the Personal Ordinariate. But in the meantime, if you have questions, we'd love to hear from you. Visit our online community, perhaps, and find others like yourself, community.chnetwork.org. And these programs and everything else we do are offered as free of charge as possible because of the generous support of our partners in mission, and you can join them at chnetwork.org/compass. My guest is Msgr Jeffrey Steenson, who is known well around these parts because he is an Episcopal advisor. He's been on a number of our Coming Home Network retreats. He's even had the distinct honor of helping receive people back into the Catholic Church at some of our Coming Home Network retreats. He has a background as an Anglican priest and bishop in the Episcopalian Church. He has got all kinds of interesting stories to tell about how we ended up with this thing that everybody calls by a different name. Some people call it the Anglican Ordinariate, although that's not technically what it's called. But Msgr Steenson, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you. Great to be with you, Matt.
So we got a lot of history to cover, a lot of personal history that you actually experienced today. But just for a little context, what sector of the Anglican world do you come from?
Okay. Well, do you mean in terms of I was ordained in the Episcopal Church?
Right. So just the regular Episcopalian Church, is that how you grew up?
That's right. Yeah.
So
no, I grew up in the Evangelical Free Church.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. And then it was while I was at college, at Trinity College in Deerfield, Illinois, that I started to want to figure out what came after the apostles. I mean, seems like a whole lot of centuries got skipped over. And I started studying the early church fathers, and that led me toward the Catholic Church. I had just gotten married, and my advisor suggested that I might want to look at the Episcopal Church. So that was about a 28-year detour in my life. So,
well, I think it's so interesting because the ground we're going to cover actually sort of directly addresses a concern that was kind of going on in my world, as well as an evangelical in the 80s and 90s. And there were some people who wanted a little bit less of sort of like the flashiness of evangelicalism and wanted more kind of like tradition and liturgy. But Catholicism was a bridge too far, right? And so there was a bit of an Anglican halfway house. And I can't tell you how many stories we've got at the Coming Home Network of people who have gone that similar track. But my question is, in that 28-year detour in the Episcopalian Church, where did you see yourself in relation to Catholicism? Like, what did you think that you were in relation to the Catholic Church? And was that something that was the way you thought of it kind of a common view in your world, or did you kind of have your own unique perspective on it?
No, I think I shared it with many people. We were living in the glow of the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission dialogue, ARCIC, we called it. And the idea was that we were moving toward corporate unity with the Catholic Church. I remember I was a graduate student. I'd just been recently ordained as an Anglican. I was a graduate student at Oxford, and I took a trip up one day to visit the retired Archbishop of Canterbury, Michael Ramsey, who was living in Durham. And he's fascinating and famous because he's the first Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury to have met with the Pope since the Reformation. And there was an amazing day in the 1960s where Pope Paul VI took off his ring and gave it to Archbishop Michael. And so we went up to see him. We sat down for lunch. He said, before we have lunch, would you like to kiss my ring? There were three of us there with him. But what we were talking about was, we feel called to the Catholic Church. Should we come? Should we make this journey? And Archbishop Michael said, no, don't yet. Be patient. Union is just over the horizon, and you will experience it in your lifetime. That was how hopeful everything was at that point. But then,
now, this is, by the way, remind us what year this is, because
this would
that
be
kind of
about
helps.
1980, 81, something like that.
Yeah, a lot has happened in the world of Episcopalianism since that time.
Yeah. Then the ordination of women certainly divided up the Anglican world badly. The whole question of homosexuality and homosexual marriages and things like that. Those were things that made it just basically shot an arrow through the heart of the ecumenical movement. And therefore we had to find another path across the Tiber, basically.
I find it interesting, and I don't know how much weight there is to my own thoughts on these these matters, but so often when people look at the way that different mainline denominations have kind of gone, and some of the various things that they teach now that they didn't used to teach many years ago, often it's kind of couched as they used to believe this about morality, and they now believe this other thing about morality. And I wonder if it's maybe not a deeper question about, the authority of Scripture, or what defines, what it is that we're doing here, in general. If that's, it seems to me like the identity crisis that was going on in the Episcopal world, as well as in a lot of other worlds, had a lot less to do with like a specific kind of sexual expression, and a lot more to do with kind of like foundations in some ways.
Yeah. Though we had in the Anglican world, at least in the part of the Anglican Church that I was spending my time with, there was generally a consensus with what the Catholic Church teaches, with a few notable exceptions. Obviously, the Pope didn't fit into the system too smoothly.
No,
but all the other essential things were, including Mary. I remember preaching many sermons as an Anglican on the Blessed Virgin, and so I guess for those of us in that Anglican world, it was not such a difficult theological journey for us. It had a lot more to do with, I'll tell you in a little bit more about this, but we were taught that we were part of the Catholic Church. We were a branch of the Catholic Church. And for those that wanted to come back into the Catholic Church, it would have been Pope Leo IX, who decreed that Anglican orders are null and void, absolutely null and utterly void. And so in order to make that journey, it required, for a clergyman, it required being ordained in absolute form, as if you weren't ever ordained before. And that was a hard thing for a lot of my colleagues to deal with.
If you could maybe recap why it was that the Catholic Church looked at the Anglican world and said, we can't say that this is a continuation anymore. Like what changed to cause that?
Oh, it would have had a lot to do with how King Henry VIII kind of basically rewrote the Church of England. That kind of unity, that solidarity kind of was broken at that point. It was a different way of understanding how holy orders happen. And so the Holy Father, I think, was right in the judgment he made that there was a definite cut in the Reformation. And so holy orders have to be addressed like that.
Yeah. There's just a lot to kind of like dig into here. It's so interesting to talk to people who come from evangelical worlds into the Anglican Church and how they think about this question compared to people who, perhaps grew up in Anglican or Episcopalian contexts and how they think about this. So just from my own perspective as an evangelical, because I never did the stopover. I never entered the Anglican halfway house. By the time I was, really serious.
We call it the via media, by the way.
The via media, right.
Yeah.
And some people just stay there for a couple of days. It's like a weekend stay. But for me in my evangelical world, how I envisioned Christian unity was if we could all just get around a table and agree on the same points of doctrine, we would be one. Which is, of course, the more I think about that, the more I realize just how impossible that would be. You can't even get Catholics to get around the table and and do that sort of thing. And as I came more towards a sacramental view of things, I came to understand that the view of unity in that kind of world is when we all eat at the same table, we will be one. But what did unity look like to you? Like what, as you were envisioning and yearning for Christian unity in your time as an Episcopalian priest, like what did you think it would look like? Would it look like you giving up your Anglican tradition to join a Romanized world? Or, I mean, how did it look? Do you think you would ever be able to bring that stuff in with you?
We thought, well, in the 80s, we thought, well, in the 70s and 80s, the model was that Anglican identity the Anglican world would come into full communion with the Catholic Church, but it would retain its own distinct identity. In terms of liturgy, in terms of a married priesthood, things like that. And so the idea was that the essential ecclesial identity that we had wouldn't change. And that the Catholic Church would recognize that and welcome it because of her belief that there should be diversity. It goes all the way back to Pope Gregory the Great, when he sent Augustine to England to evangelize England.
The Angles, right?
The Angles, yeah. And he said, you don't need to turn them into Latins. The Catholic Church can accept this culture and make room for it.
So what's very interesting, I mean, there's a million interesting things about this to me, but we have all these Eastern rites within the Church, who have kind of their own liturgical patrimony that comes up, with its own language all the way up from the beginning. Like I think of the Maronites, who still do the words of consecration in Aramaic, the language of our Lord. Whereas the Church of England was speaking Latin and then English. So you are actually in some ways part of the Latin patrimony, but also English. So what kind of, I guess, challenge did that pose to this question of you're not just being like this, 2,000-year-old tradition that now kind of pledges allegiance to Rome, but you're kind of like a splinter off of the whole Latin tree?
Well, one thing, again, for people that have spent some time in the Anglican Church, they would understand this. The prayer book evolved over the years from, the original 1662 prayer book to, in the United States, the 1928 prayer book. But then there was the newer 1979 prayer book, or was it 82? I can't remember when it came out, but the new prayer book. And that prayer book was so similar in the liturgy and things like that with the Roman Missal. there were a lot of similarities. At that point, ecumenical cooperation on the liturgical front was pretty significant. So it was a fairly simple transition, really. And I remember when I was a graduate student in England, I was fascinated with all of these Anglo-Catholic clergy that I met all over England who had abandoned the Book of Common Prayer for the second edition of the Roman Missal.
The Roman Missal.
Because they felt more at home with it. And in England, they didn't really chase after. There was no liturgical police running around, so they were able to do that. So I knew a lot of Anglican priests that used the Roman Missal as part of their parochial ministry.
So one more question before I get into some more kind of nuts and bolts in your personal experience of the history. And that is this: when people come to us at the Coming Home Network, I often get asked the question, what are the two biggest groups of people that you end up, walking with as they come into the church? And I usually say the Anglicans and the Baptists. The Anglicans because they're so close, and the Baptists because they're so far, right? There's these are the two groups that we end up working with the most. And then so the follow-up question is usually something like, well, who are the hardest two groups to get through to? And I usually say, well, it's the Anglicans because they're so close, and the Baptists because they're so far. In some ways, you talked about branch theory and this idea that there's this whole school of Anglican thought that says, well, we are Catholic. We're just the English expression. There's the Roman expression. There's the Eastern expression. How did that particular branch theory conversation factor in as you were discussing the question of what unity might look like?
Well, I can remember you'll appreciate this, the words of Saint Irenaeus of Lyon. It is necessary for all churches to be in accord with the Church of Rome on account of her more excellent apostolic foundations. That text grabbed a hold of me, and I lived with that for all of my Anglican days, basically, trying to make sense of it. I knew that there was, to quote, the Vatican II text on this, there was certainly elements of holiness in the Anglican world that I lived, but they were forces impelling toward Catholic unity. And I guess Irenaeus just kept coming back and back to me. I remember doing a paper once at an Anglican conference on it, and people were so angry. I was up in Canada, and somebody said, I think we should send you to Sydney. That's where they took all the prisoners in the British Empire.
Send you off to that prison colony down under.
That's one. That's
yeah. Well, you got together with a group of people. That a meeting took place between you and then Cardinal Ratzinger. Was he prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at the time? How did that all come together, and who all went from your delegation?
Sure. Okay. Can I just give you a quick little overview of all this? So people that are coming to the Catholic Church from the Anglican world, most of them probably come just as individuals, and they become Catholic. They enter their local parish, their local diocese, and they become part of their Catholic world. Then there were people on the other side that were groups. They wanted to come as groups, and this dates all the way back to 1980, when Pope John Paul created the pastoral provision, it's called, and it had two elements to it. One was to allow men who were married to be ordained in the Catholic Church. and the other was that it allowed groups to become Catholic and still hold together as an Anglican community. These were called pastoral provision communities. And there was even, they worked very hard. They even came up with, I don't know, can you see that? The Book of Divine Worship. That was done in, it came out just at the beginning of this century, but it came out of that world, which was to give these congregations their liturgy, their Anglican liturgy, but approved by the Catholic Church. Well, that didn't grow very much because basically these pastoral provision communities were incorporated into the local diocese, and they kind of just sort of fizzled out, if you will. And that's when the whole idea of creating an entity, an ordinariate, an ecclesial entity that would be a quasi-diocese, if you will, that's what began to come together. And there were a lot of meetings in Rome during the 1980s and early 1990s. So the Holy See, mainly in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, they were very involved in all this stuff. And the one I was involved with, which is really, I think, the decisive one that happened, was it happened on October 19th, 1993. And it was a meeting at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith with Cardinal Ratzinger and two of his senior associates in the congregation. And I was there with my bishop at the time, Clarence Pope from Fort Worth, Pope, and Dr. Wayne Hankey from Canada was there. The other significant person that was present was Cardinal. Well, yes, at that point, Cardinal Bernard Law. Cardinal Law is probably most responsible for moving this whole thing forward from his early days as Bishop of Springfield, Cape Girardeau in Missouri. And he's the one that helped bring the pastoral provision to be. And he was the one that really was a great advocate for what ultimately would become the Ordinariate. But we put together a proposal, and we presented it to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, basically asking for what we would call the Ordinariate. It would be an ecclesial entity equivalent to a diocese that would allow congregations to, basically come together and keep their distinct identity, not simply be absorbed. And what was so impressive about that, as I remember it, is how incredibly pastoral and encouraging Cardinal Ratzinger was. And he had the support of Pope John Paul as well. So there was a tremendous amount of warmth from them. We had the meeting, but it kind of went quiet for some 15 years or so. I guess they were studying it. There were other meetings going on. I went back just to being, I was at that point I was serving as a rector in Fort Worth. I wound up in Albuquerque, ultimately to be the bishop of that Anglican diocese there. But I was told by my Catholic friends to be patient. Don't do anything on your own. Be patient. Let this work out, and especially be patient. Don't come without your wife, they told me. It was very important. So we needed that. My wife, Debbie, needed to come along too. So it took her a little more time. But it all, for me, the great moment was in 2007 when the Episcopal Church House of Bishops made this declaration that they had proper authority, not only disciplinary matters, but over doctrinal matters, which that's a denial of Catholicity. How can you be Catholic if you're a local church making decisions on doctrine? I knew that was the end of the road for me, and through the help of the Archbishop of Santa Fe, I was able to make that journey into the Catholic Church, and it was, everything. So much happened, and that happened in 2007, and I started teaching in a seminary.
As a layman? You came in as a layman, right?
I was ordained in 2008.
Okay, so you did under the pastoral provision?
That's correct.
Yeah.
And then I was ordained as a priest of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. I was teaching at the seminary in Houston, and one day I got a phone call from Cardinal Donald Wuerl saying, I didn't even know any of this was going on. I knew that the Ordinariate had been created because Pope Benedict had issued Anglicanorum Coetibus.
And when was it that? Yes. So what year was Anglicanorum Coetibus issued?
That would have been in 2000 and I always have to look all these numbers.
So is it 11?
Now.
I can't remember. I'm terrible about these things.
It was 2009 is when November 2009 is when he issued it. But
the announcement.
The Ordinariate wasn't created for another year. So the first one was in England in January of 2011. And then the United States and Canada was created in January of 2012. And I can remember so clearly Christmas Eve morning, 2011, I get a phone call from Cardinal Wuerl saying, they've asked me to call you and ask you if you would accept the appointment of Ordinary of the Personal Ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter. And I said, Cardinal Wuerl, can I pray about it? And he said, well, of course you can pray about it, but remember, it's Christmas Eve, and it's 6 hours ahead of time in Rome, and they want to go home for Christmas. So I had a 1-minute prayer that I jumped into at that point. So,
wow.
And those were very busy years, those early years, just getting it all organized and helping clergy come over with their congregations. We had some remarkable experiences because I was given strict instructions from the Holy See not to burn bridges or to alienate these ecumenical relationships. And so we were able to work out agreements with the Episcopal dioceses around the country to purchase the properties, things like that, so that everything kind of went smoothly. I lost one congregation because I refused to join them in a litigation against their Anglican diocese. We were not permitted to do that. But most everybody else it was a very positive experience, and it was, I think, the wisdom of the Holy See that there are these two ways to unity. You're taking the more direct line across the Tiber, but we still don't want to close the door to the others, and so let's not alienate them. That was the idea.
Yeah, there's so many questions I have about what it was like to get that call and go from being a seminary professor to bishop of an entire continent, which is essentially what you were, right? Because the chair of St. Peter's, that ordinariate covers the U.S. and Canada.
U.S. and Canada, right. Uh-huh.
And then the other ordinariate, it covers England and Wales, and then there's the other one of the Southern Cross, correct?
Southern Cross, which is Australia and New Zealand, and also parts of Papua New Guinea as well.
Yeah. So those are all those, but it's one other thing about the pastoral provision and why it was kind of this inadequate arrangement, or why it didn't cover everything. And I wonder if you have any more comments on this. But one of the things that I've encountered is that sometimes a person will come in and they'll be like, well, is it possible for me to become a priest since I was a pastor in my previous tradition? Can I become a priest through the pastoral provision? And the answer is usually depends on your bishop, right? And
that's the answer.
And some people might say, does it mean depends on whether your bishop is conservative or liberal? And that doesn't really cover the question, because often it has to do with, well, a bishop is used to providing salary and health care for one guy at a time. And here you've got a guy with his 5 kids coming over, and this is just a different kind of thing to deal with. So I imagine that's one of the many inadequacies that was being discussed in terms of the pastoral provision before the ordinariate came to bear.
No, that's right. And that's still today. I've talked to so many guys as well. You guys send people over to me. I talk to them, and I keep stressing the point. If you want to explore a vocation as a Catholic priest, you absolutely have to have the active support of your local bishop, because your file will go nowhere without your bishop's support, active support too. He's got to kind of stay on to it. And over the years, they've raised some standards. So typically now they would ask somebody that's a convert just come into the church, they would ask him to be patient and live as a layman for a couple of years. And then you can start the formation process, which might be, if they had an MDiv from an accredited seminary, maybe another couple of years of study. So it's not an easy road. And then there's all the practical stuff about how to support your family and all that sort of thing too. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, and I know that too. There were some, because this thing was just this brand new scenario. I know you had some people who came in and were like, well, no, I think I'm supposed to be diocesan, after that, right? I mean, this is just, I mean, here we are, it's 2025. This thing is still a baby in the life of the church, right? And
it is. Yeah.
I mean, how soon did you realize that this was going to be the kind of thing that needed lots more help and couldn't just be pushed down the hill and go on its own?
Well, one thing that really came to me was, as we grew, I guess we had about 70 clergy in the ordinariate. But a priest needs a bishop. I'm married. I couldn't be a bishop. And so I went to Rome and asked if we could have a bishop. And they were wonderful about it and gave us a spectacular fellow, Bishop Stephen Lopes, who knew more about this whole question of the ordinariate than anyone, because he was working at the dicastery for Doctrine of the Faith for many years. So now I think what we're seeing, what Bishop Lopes is trying to do is, the door is still open for, if a man who's ordained and married and bring a congregation with him, he could come into the ordinariate. But in the long haul, they're trying to create a celibate priesthood. So they have a half a dozen, I think, now, guys that are celibate in formation. Matt, I don't know if I've ever told you the story. When I was ordained a Catholic priest, I was in Albuquerque where it happened. Just before
the 2008?
Yeah, this was in 2008. Well, this was 2009, February 2009. I was ordained a deacon in 2008 and priest in February 2009. Just before the ordination service started, I was in a conference room with the Archbishop and my wife, and I had to sign, as every married priest does before he's ordained, I had to sign by hand a statement saying that if I were ever widowed, I would accept the Latin discipline of celibacy.
Which deacons have to do as well, I believe.
Yeah.
Right?
So I signed it, and I gave it to the Archbishop, and he held it up to my wife, and she had a big grin on her face, and she said, "This is a really good deal."
Now, she didn't have to sign any such paper, did she?
No.
Oh, well, there you go.
No, she didn't. She didn't. But so I think it's very important that people understand that the ordinariate and the pastoral provision are absolutely not about advocating for a married clergy. It was a provision it was a pastoral consideration given to us by the Holy See. But it would be inappropriate for us to be out there advocating for married priests.
Yeah, this is something that Catholics sometimes have a difficulty in understanding. I don't have a difficulty in understanding this because I come from the evangelical world, right? And so the idea of a priest being able to give his whole heart and soul and life to a flock is a really kind of a beautiful thing to be able to. I mean, if you called any of the pastors at my evangelical churches in the middle of the night and said, "So and so's dying, we need the sacraments now," he'd have been like, "Well, let me ask my wife." Like these are considerations, right? Anybody who thinks that it'd be great to have a priest with a wife and kids running on the property has never seen a preacher's kid smoking weed behind the church, right? Like these things happen, like when you involve families in the situation. But the other thing too, Monsignor Steenson, is that you've got some unique stuff that's never happened in the Anglican Ordinariate that we just kind of have to wait and see on. So, for instance, right now, your clergy are all coming. I mean, most of your clergy are converts, right? I would think almost all of the clergy in the Ordinariate at this point are still converts, and we haven't even had the phenomenon of people who grew up their whole life, baptized in babies in the Ordinariate and then are ordained to the priesthood in the Ordinariate. This is a phenomenon that hasn't happened because the Ordinariate's not been around long enough yet.
No. One of the interesting problems we had to deal with, we had a few cases of reverts. People had grown up Catholic, and then they, in their teenage years, maybe they wandered off into an evangelical world, and then they wanted to come back. And so that required us going to Rome to get a dispensation for that. It was called dispensation for the delict of schism.
Yeah, I talked to one who got that letter, and he said he got the letter. He's like, "You have been dispensed from the sin of schism." He's like, "Whoa, I'm framing this." Yeah,
and it was interesting how they understood it or how they justified it. It was because of the inadequate catechetical preparation that was given to these young people. So it was basically the Catholic Church looking on herself with, some proper judgmental attitude on this. I don't think we see that anymore, but there were a few cases like that where we had to go to Rome for help.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the one in particular that comes to mind of a guy who actually I believe might have even been in Catholic seminary for formation, but things were so wacky that he was like, "Well, they don't believe in the core doctrines of like the faith anymore here. I'm going to go someplace that does hold to like the Trinity and the real resurrection, the bodily resurrection of Jesus and some of these other things. So yeah, I mean, these are just wacky times that produce this sort of cases. But I imagine that you also had some really kind of bizarre weekends where you ended up bringing a priest into the church and then his building into the church and then the whole congregation into the church over the course of like a weekend. I'm sure that happened.
Oh, it did. And the first year, when we were bringing, the first year when we had congregations to be received, the Holy See was so wonderful about giving us we were able to do a concentrated formation program for these clergy. Basically, it was like a long Lent. And then once they had done that, they could be received along with their congregation and ordained that weekend, basically, by the local bishop. So it was, the Catholic Church was just so wonderful in working with these situations like that.
You know, at the same time, you mentioned the necessity of being kind of delicate and not stepping on a lot of toes. And you mentioned it in terms of like the litigation, like making sure people like bought their buildings, right? If they didn't already own them. In some cases, they already do own them because just the way that the world works. There's so many different flavors of Anglicanism, and they all have different kinds of polity on those kinds of questions. But also, I mean, it's got to be kind of like this awkward thing the next time you and a bunch of Anglican Ordinariate people are sitting in an ecumenical meeting with Anglicans who are still Anglican, right? And I mean, that's got to be like what are they thinking? Are they thinking, you guys are defectors, or man, that looks pretty good over there in Rome? Or, I mean, what kind of awkward conversations did this produce, or has this continued to produce?
Well, it is awkward, and it continues to be. For one thing, we don't have any real conversations with the ecumenical office at the USCCB, because we're an embarrassment to them. So there are a lot of Catholics that feel that this was a mistake. Not maybe a lot, but there are some that, because it messes up the ecumenical world. I remember when the Ordinariate was created in England, the front page headline I think it was the London Daily Telegraph. So that would have been January 15, 2011. But the headline read, "Pope parks tanks on Rowan's lawn." Rowan Williams was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Right. So yeah. So I mean, there was a lot of sensitivity about all that sort of thing. And I think the Ordinariate people have really done very, very well in being careful. And what Pope Francis used to tell us to do is not to proselytize. Don't be overt proselytizers, But so that's hard. But I tried in a couple of instances to connect with my old colleagues in the Episcopal Church, even to the point of maybe attending a bishop's conference meeting as an observer. And basically I was told, don't do it. It's too awkward. And so it still continues to be, it's an edgy subject.
Yeah, well, it is interesting. And this kind of plays into the question of being a convert in general. We have all these people come to us at the Coming Home Network and like, what do I say to my family and friends? And I really don't have a good answer for that. All I can say is that I came into the church in 2005 and have just been sort of trying to bide my time. I made some mistakes of getting in heated conversations at the beginning that I wish I could take back. I had a lot of, kind of fire in my belly at that time, and I would love to have not burned those bridges as you were advised to not do. And then I just have kind of kept my peace and tried to live as the best Catholic I could for the intervening time. And there are, as a result of playing that long game for the past probably 15 of these 20 years that I've been Catholic, when Pope Francis died and Pope Leo got elected, my phone was ringing off the hook with people who are suddenly curious about Catholicism, and I'm the only Catholic they knew, on the inside, as it were. And so I think, I do wonder, like, what will the long game look like? What will it look like if we have more of an opportunity to see what develops over the course of these years once the vocations, like the native vocations of the ordinariate, begin to spring up? What will that look like? I wonder. I mean, we don't have any data because it hasn't happened yet, but I wonder what you hope it'll look like.
Oh, that's a wonderful question, Matt. I don't know the answer to it. One of the challenges that I think the ordinariate faces is to be welcoming and compelling to a typical Episcopalian. What happened in some of the ordinariate communities. Now, I don't mean this as a criticism, it just kind of happened, but it became so high church, if you will, so traditionalist. It began to attract traditionalist Catholics. Our cathedral down in Houston, during the COVID lockdowns, it grew exponentially because you could receive communion in both kinds at the ordinariate, whereas in the archdiocesan parishes, it was very restricted, and people started to flock to it. And I've heard ordinariate people talking about how their liturgy is, you can think of it like it's the extraordinary form in English. That's the language they would use sometimes for it. Which the problem is, we're then attracting the wrong people. God bless the traditionalists in the Catholic world, but that's not what the ordinariate was created for. We were created to be a bridge for people coming into the church from outside, and so that's my concern, is that that we don't lose that sort of evangelical perspective.
You bring up a couple of things, and maybe these will be like one of the last topics we hit, so neither one of us gets into trouble. But I've also talked to some folks who are my evangelical comrades, right? Who went into the world of Anglicanism and have felt that pull on their heart towards, what would it look like to be in full communion with the Catholic Church? But then they look around and they see what the suburban parish scene is like where they are, and they think, would I give up my liturgical bounty for, songs that sound like they're recycled from 1970s Hallmark commercials or something like that, right? There's like this aesthetic obstacle, and I think that there is a sense in which that the ordinariate helps kind of, where the ordinariate is available, helps kind of like assuage that, that fear and that concern, because it's not just a mere concern like, my taste is different. There is a real desire to worship God with the reverence due him. But at the same time, Monsignor Steenson, there is also, and I don't want to step on any feelings here either, but like the Anglophile world out there who loves like Agatha Christie and the BBC and Masterpiece Theater, and to them it can just be like an aesthetic. Right. And I wonder if you've dealt with like the dangers of that as well, of like just seeing this as like a cool aesthetic and forgetting like maybe what this was built to be.
Yes. Well put. And yes, I've struggled with that. It's very much always present. And I go back to that day, that meeting we had with Cardinal Ratzinger in 1993, where he kept bringing up, he said, this whole enterprise has to be about evangelization. I mean, he kept coming home to that point. And it's not about creating a liturgical culture or, that kind of distinct identity. ultimately it has to be about bringing the gospel to people.
Well, anything else from that meeting with Cardinal Ratzinger? Any tidbits that might be fun just to kind of share for an inside window between what would become the next pope and kind of how he thought and how that whole thing was materializing?
Yes, and this might have a slight edge to it, so I apologize in advance. We told Cardinal Ratzinger at that meeting that one of the things that discouraged us so much about our experience as Anglicans is that whenever serious doctrinal questions came up, the attitude was, well, we need to go and have this decided by committees and councils and assemblies. And when we told Ratzinger that, he immediately jumped on it and he said, that's our problem too. We have theologians that think that consults are more important than looking to the magisterium. And I couldn't help but think now, in light of the whole synodality stuff that we've been through, Pope Benedict was very wise in understanding the limitations of that stuff. At the end of the day, it's what Peter teaches.
Yeah. That may be the hardest pill for an Anglican to swallow coming across, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's a certain odd freedom in that. And it's kind of hard to explain to somebody on the outside, but here we are in 2025, and at least as of this recording, well, we'll just back up a few months when our Holy Father Pope Francis went to his reward, and the whole world was watching as he made his final journey on this part of his earthly pilgrimage. And the whole world was watching in those days in between until the white smoke came out and out came Leo XIV on the balcony. And there was just this surge of joy and life injected into the church. In this ancient institution that people should not care about any longer, right? At the same time, there's another open seat that opened up this year in January, and that's the Seat of Canterbury in the Church of England. And as of our recording, here we are in the middle of the summer, and it's not been full, and there are no cameras watching outside the cathedral to see who's going to come out as the new Archbishop. I mean, it's an odd sort of thing to be in, and I'm wondering if it's even the kind of thing that Benedict could have envisioned happening this soon, after his own passing. But here we are. The Church of Rome rolls on. The Church of England has a big question mark hanging over it, and that's just a strange position to be in,
Oh, it's going to be so hard. I know the people that I know that have kind of hung in there. It's hard. It's really hard for them to. I couldn't do it, but God bless people, and I hope they'll be able to hang on to the faith in spite of those challenges they face. But it is so comforting as a Catholic to know. I don't understand what the Holy Father is saying. He seems to be talking funny to me, but I don't need to worry about it because the Holy Spirit will guide this church. And I think, with Pope Leo now, we're seeing, the ship coming back to its course, if you will.
Well, and maybe that's a good one to close on because, John Paul II talked about breathing with both lungs of the church, the East and the West. Paul VI, who you mentioned, having that meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury for the first time since the Reformation, he also met with Patriarch Athenagoras, if I recall.
That's right.
And then, under Benedict, there were all kinds of meetings with the Orthodox. Pope Francis spoke very strongly about his desire to build bridges with the Orthodox. And here it was in the first couple of weeks of Leo's papacy, and he's sitting down meeting with the Eastern churches and Eastern rites of the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches and talking explicitly about a desire for visible unity. I mean, maybe the last question I have is, do you think that something like what we've seen with the fruits of Anglicanorum Coetibus can be a building block in that conversation with our Eastern brothers and sisters.
I hope so. And one of the things that I'm so excited about this year, I think it's on St. Andrew's Day, Pope Leo is going to visit the Ecumenical Patriarch, and they're going to make a journey together to Nicaea to commemorate the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. And what they've said is, which is a very interesting thing, because the one item that is the real sticking point between Orthodox and Catholic understanding is the filioque clause in the Creed. And I think we'll see that being specifically addressed again.
It'll be an unavoidable topic if they're both there in Nicaea for the anniversary.
That's right. Yeah.
It would be hard to talk around it. But Msgr Steenson, thank you so much for spending a little time and sharing some of your own personal experience of the ordinary. We have so many members who come to us from the world of Anglicanism and Episcopalianism, and even folks like me who were we're nuts off the Wesleyan tree, right? We're all kind of connected back to this thing in a lot of ways, and I just really appreciate the time that you've given to the Coming Home Network over the years, and in regard to all
and
this.
to the Coming Home Network primaries that have made so many sacrifices to come into the church. God bless you. I pray for you. And remember what Simon Peter asked the Lord, what's in it for us? And Jesus answered, eternal life.
Not a bad deal, Jesus also said, "You are my friends if you do what I command you." Well, Msgr Steenson, again, I hope people check out the stories that you've shared in other places through the Deep in History series that you did with Marcus on Saint Irenaeus, who is now a doctor of the Church, and wasn't when you started that series. That's so cool. And then, of course, you've been on the journey home a couple of times as well. And again, if you're coming from this background, if you are a clergy member in the Anglican world, please reach out to us. We'll put you directly in touch with Msgr Steenson. You won't be the first person like yourself that he's talked to. So thank you again for joining us on this episode of Coming Home Network Presents. Again, CHNetwork.org if you want to reach out to us. I'm Matt Swaim. Have a wonderful day.
God bless you.